Hello and welcome. My name is Brian Terry, and I'm a Senior Solution Architect at Amazon Web Services. And I wanted to first start off by thanking you for attending my session, Managing Configuration and Compliance in Hybrid Environments. I have over 20 years experience in the IT field, including being a developer, a system admin, to a solution architect. And one of the things I've always kind of struggled with is maintaining configuration and compliance in my environments when needed. One of the things that I struggled with was if I was running a bunch of servers or had a bunch of apps running in my location, how did I keep track of those things? And those questions always kind of kept me up at night. But luckily, AWS has a suite of tools that help me try to simplify that process. So I went down the route of looking at AWS tooling, and I always fell back to a quote by Albert Einstein. And that quote is, "Out of clutter, find simplicity. From discord, find harmony. In the middle of difficulty lies an opportunity." And I found an opportunity to try to quantify and understand my environment by using AWS Management Suite of tools. So AWS has a number of different toolings that help customers and people like me enable, provision, and operate within their environment. But in this talk, we're just going to be talking about one specific service, AWS Config. And I have to say that AWS Config is one of my favorite resources. It actually helped me try to quantify what was running in my environment. And let's talk a little bit about the agenda of this talk. So first, we'll be talking a little bit about capturing resource and inventory and compliance history in config. Basically, this is a recap of the config service itself. Then we're going to talk a little bit about extending config so you can see or have other resources in your config environment that include resources that are not typically AWS resources. This can include on-prem servers or applications or virtually anything. And then I'm going to show you a demonstration of capturing a custom third-party config item. And finally, we'll just wrap it up. So let's start off by talking about capturing resource inventory and configuration history over time. So some of the questions that may come to your mind when you're trying to track your inventory or configuration items in your data center or in AWS is, what's currently out there? What's the latest configuration state of my resources? What relationship exists between my resources? What configuration changes have occurred in the past? What resources have violated compliance policy? Furthermore, if you look at the governance side of your infrastructure, some of the questions that may come to your mind is, are my resources properly configured? Do my resources comply with regulatory requirements? How do I ensure continuous compliance? How can I get notified in near real time of my resources that go out of compliance? So luckily, AWS Config helps you answer these questions. So let's talk about the benefits of config. So the first benefit is continuous monitoring. AWS Config continuously monitors your infrastructure for changes. You can continuously assess your environment by using AWS Config. It tracks change management over time. And it helps you with operational troubleshooting. And finally, this is enterprise-wide. So not only in one AWS account, you can have this in multiple AWS accounts or across your organization. So let's talk a little bit about how config works. First, a configuration change happens that is sent to AWS Config. And then you can define rules on what happens when these configuration changes happen. And when a configuration change happens, AWS Config notifies you in a number of different ways, including the console itself, Amazon SNS, Amazon CloudWatch, or Amazon S3. So let's take a look at some of the features of AWS Config at a high level. Configuration history of all your AWS resources over time. Configuration history of your software using the SSM agent. Configuration snapshots. This allows you to take snapshots of your environment and see that configuration in a point of time. and configurable and customizable rules. So if we saw earlier, we saw that you can define these rules. Well, you can customize these rules and create them in such a way that meets your needs. Furthermore, we talk about resource relationship tracking. So if you have a CI that's an EC2 instance, well, you can map that to the VPC that it's running in. And you can have a timeline of that changing over time. It's also a conformance pack. You know, we talked a little bit about those rules earlier. Well, basically, you can put those rules in one complete bucket and deploy those across your organizations. And that's called conformance packs. And additionally, config can run in multi-account, multi-region, multi-accounts and multi-regions. Allows you to aggregate these configuration changes into one single dashboard. And finally, the Cloud Governance Dashboard. So basically, you can log into one AWS account and see the configuration of all your AWS resources across your organization. So let's take a quick look at what the AWS Config dashboard looks like. So if we're looking at the current slide, we can see here that this is an EC2 instance. And I'm able to see valuable information about this EC2 instance, including when it was created, what availability zone it's running in, some information about its IP addresses, its DNS information, and its instance size. But if we were to click on the button at the top right, which is the resource timeline, we will see more detailed information about this EC2 instance. This includes its changes over time. And as you can see, we're able to go back as far as we need to try to understand what changed in our environment and how it changed. This is very valuable information for you when you need this in the time of anything, like if you have a critical down issue in your account, or you're just trying to understand your compliance state. This information becomes very valuable. So now we've seen what config can do and how awesome it is. So now let's take a look at how you can extend config to look at things that are not necessarily AWS CIs. So let's talk a little bit about extending that into your data center or any kind of system at all. So how do we extend this? So basically, let's take a 10,000-foot view of how this works. Again, if a configuration change, this configuration change is sent to config. And then these rules are applied and the notifications are sent, just like we previously talked about with config working with native AWS resources. However, these resources can be pretty much anything. These custom CIs, they can be generic databases, tape storage, traditional servers, users, etc. And you can track these just like you would any kind of AWS resource or any kind of AWS CI. So how do you develop these third-party resources? Well, it's a very simple process. So first, using the AWS CLI or CloudFormation CLI, and I'll show a little bit about this in the demo. Basically, you generate a project. It generates a schema. You edit that schema. Then once you do that, you submit it to the CloudFormation registry. And then you deploy it. You deploy it within your environment. And we'll get to see a little bit about this when we get into the demonstration. So for this demonstration, I'm so excited to try to show you this example of how this works. Well, I could have gone with something simple like your standard web server or configuration of a switch, etc. But however, I wanted to make unicorns. And I also want to be able to track my unicorns. So I'm going to be showing you how you can track the configuration state of your unicorns. So I'm going to be creating a custom config CI called Brian Terry Majestic Animal. And let's take a quick look at the shape of this resource. So my resource is going to have a unique ID. It's going to have a name. And my unicorns are going to have a color. So using this schema, I'm actually going to be able to track all my unicorns. I'm going to be able to track when their name changed, when their color changed, and sadly, when we no longer have any unicorns, I'm actually going to be able to see when that happened. So I know you're excited just like me, so you can take a look at some of the properties. So some of the properties that include is the unique ID we talked about, but now let's actually jump into the demo and I'll actually show you how all this works. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to begin by downloading the CloudFormation CLI. So you can actually go to the GitHub repository, and there are detailed information about how to install the CloudFormation CLI. And the first thing I'm going to do is just copy this simple command, and I'm going to take it over to my computer terminal. I'm actually going to put it inside my terminal and go ahead and install the CloudFormation CLI. As you can see, that one command installs everything I need in order to get started with the CloudFormation CLI. Some of the other dependencies include the AWS CLI, but it's fully laid out and documented in the GitHub repository. So we're going to give that a second to let that install. All right, and now it's installed. So now we're going to generate our project. And we're going to do that by using the init command. And what init command is going to do is ask us a couple questions about a resource. So the first thing I want to do is give it a name. Just like you saw earlier in the slides, I'm going to call it Brian Terry, the majestic animal. All right, and I'm going to select my language. For this demo, I'm going to choose Java. I'm going to leave all the standard things in place. And now if we take a quick look at the generated project, you're going to see that there are a bunch of files here. So let's jump into our IDE and take a deeper look at some of these files. So you'll notice that this is your standard project for creating CloudFormation third-party resources, including all the handlers. But for the sake of this presentation, we're just going to leave all that in place, and we're just going to focus on the schema. So for our majestic animal, we need to define the shape of our resource. So the first thing we're going to do is actually remove all the boilerplate code that's included with generating a project. And I'm going to paste in the schema for our majestic animal. And the first thing I'm going to start off by doing is changing the link to the repo. And I'm going to set that to my GitHub repo. And this is mainly so there's documentation on the schema itself. So when you click in the CloudFormation console, you actually be able to see more details about it. So I'm going to actually enter that link here. And now we're going to take a quick look at our schema. As you can see, I laid our schema out just like we kind of talked about. It has a unique ID. A unicorn has a name. It has a color. And is read-only properties, and I'm also set the primary identifier to be the UID. And I've left everything else in place. So now that we have our schema generated, now let's go over to our console, and now we're going to generate our project. So this command helps you to, make sure that your schema is valid. And you can see when we generate it, our schema is valid. And the next thing that we need to do is we need to submit the resource. So we're going to go to the CloudFormation console. And let's jump over there and take a quick look. So in our CloudFormation console, if you go to registry and you go to private type, as you can see, there are no resources here right now. So now we're going to jump back over to our command line, and we're going to build our project. We're going to use Maven because, again, we use Java for this demonstration. And we're going to build our resource. And we'll just give this a second. All right, our resource is built. So now let's submit our project. So we're going to use the CFN CLI tool, and we're going to submit our resource. And this just takes just a second to do. And as you can see, our resource has been successfully submitted. And it is telling us that it's registered. So let's jump over to the console and take a quick look at that. And as you can see in our console, we have our custom resource, which is our majestic animal. And it shows us the schema that we submitted, including the UID, the name, the color, and the shape of our resource. So now that we have our our custom third-party resources in CloudFormation, let's jump back over to the CLI and let's submit configuration items. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to submit a new unicorn. And we can give it a UID of resource 101. And I'm going to give it a name. And I'm also going to give it a color. So now I submitted our resource. Now let's list our configuration resource. As you can see, if we list all the majestic animals, we'll see that we have one there with the resource ID 001. So now we have our CI. So let's jump over to config and take a look and see what that looks like in the dashboard. As you can see, I have a resource identifier. It has a custom CI. We're able to see information about it. And we're also able to see this compliance over time. As you can see, it shows that I submitted my resource and this is configuration state at this point in time. As you can see, there are no changes at my resources so far. So now we've seen what it looks like in the console. Let's see what else we can do with this custom CI. So one of the things I want to do is actually change the color of the unicorn. So we're going to change it from blue to green. And we're going to submit our resource, leaving the same UID. This is going to generate a change in the configuration item inside config. Now, if we look at our configuration timeline once again, we can see that the CI was changed and it shows it going from the color of blue to the color of green. So now we can see that we can track these configuration changes over time. Now let's see what else we can do with our custom CIs. So what we're going to do is we're going to delete our unicorn. Unfortunately, unicorns have to go away sometimes. And as you can see, we removed our unicorn, and in the AWS Config console, we have no more unicorns. So that was an example of showing you how you can track any resource within your environment. So although I gave an example of a unicorn, you can use this as you can have any other resource like a server, a workstation, a user, or anything you can define within the schema. So this allows you to track configuration changes over time for any kind of resource. So my name is Brian Terry, and I would like to thank you for attending my presentation. And if you get a chance, please complete the survey at the end of this talk. Thank you again.